good.
Okay,
Good
so
now.
so so while we're here, then Ben, let's talk about Syria. Then let's thank you everyone for weighing in. Ben, let's give something. Let's give them something to think about and to listen to, which everyone came for, and talk about what we're seeing right now in Syria. This is a really historic weekend that we've just had with. So Trump announces this abrupt pullout of U.S. forces after he basically green lights a Turkish invasion. Then we have the Kurds reaching a deal with the Assad government in a bid to basically repel the Turkish invasion. A huge turning point in the proxy war that you've been covering very closely for many years. Just your overall impression of what we've just witnessed in these last couple of days.
Yeah, I'll say that this is a very important moment right now in the war on Syria. It's looking more and more actually like the war could end sometime in the near future, which is, of course, something good. And I think what's really wild about this moment is that as awful as Trump is in so many ways, Trump is actually, I think, committed to withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria, which, as many of us has been saying, it was actually the presence of the U.S. troops and the U.S. military occupation that was preventing the end of this war. And why do we know that? Because we know that the U.S. government was in fact preventing the Kurdish-led forces, the YPG and SDF. The U.S. was pressuring them and preventing them from reconciling with the Syrian government. But what we saw yesterday on Sunday, that is October 13th, we saw that the Syrian army and the YPG SDF formed an agreement to allow the Syrian army to come into northern areas of Syria. And here we have a map here of the areas of Syria where the Syrian army came in, and the agreement says that the Syrian army is now going to be coming into Manbij and Kobani. And this is also an area where Turkey, from the north, Turkey has invaded and is attacking these areas. So I think we're seeing a really important historic moment in this war. I think that as soon as the YPG and SDF and the Syrian army, as soon as they're able to reconcile, it actually could be one of the final stages to ending this war. And I think, there are a lot of people on the left who are portraying this as something very bad and saying that Trump is, he's making America's image look bad in the world. But as awful as Trump is, the war might actually be coming to an end now.
Okay, so anybody on the genuine left doesn't care about that. Like, it doesn't care about American credibility, which is, like the catchword. But there is a lot of concern for the plight of the Kurds. Huge amount of sympathy and solidarity with Rojava, where there has been this, this experiment in self-determination and of giving rights to everybody, and a society that people, naturally want to emulate because it sort of values egalitarianism and all these great things. What happens to the Kurds and to the social experiment that they've constructed inside of Syria?
Well, some people are pointing out in the live stream some really important points. Well, one, the NSA is clearly sabotaging us. No, but aside from that, Mr. A pointed out American troops are staying in Syria. Trump has not said anything about withdrawing troops from Syria. That was true until 2 days ago. And what's really interesting about it is that yesterday morning, today is the 14th, so on the 13th in the morning, you're right that at the beginning, there were a lot of misleading reports at first claiming that Trump was withdrawing the troops. There are at least 1,000 troops that have been acknowledged by the New York Times. They're illegally occupying Syrian sovereign territory. They're under violation of international law. And they happen to be in the area where the majority of Syria's oil is. What a coincidence, right? And also, this is a major breadbasket region where there's a lot of wheat production in Syria. And the U.S. has been holding this essentially hostage, preventing the Kurdish-led forces from selling that oil to Damascus. But we'll see if it actually happens. But yesterday, Trump actually did order a withdrawal. At first, Trump had ordered the troops to move, and there were around 50 to 100 troops that were on the northern border. And I'll go back to this map here. There were troops on the northern border with Turkey. And originally, Trump simply ordered to move those troops. But now, allegedly, the U.S. is going to be withdrawing all of those troops from Syria. We'll see what happens. Now, to answer your question, what's interesting is that, there's been this narrative in the corporate media for years. In fact, I was just watching a CBC report, and they referred to the Kurdish-led groups, which are known as the YPG or the SDF, the People's Protection Units, the Syrian Democratic Forces. They're basically the same thing. They're a little different, but there were reports saying that they were enemies, but actually that's not true. The YPG and the Syrian army have not really fought, and if there have been skirmishes, they've mostly been accidental. For the past 8 years, they have not been fighting each other. In fact, both of them have been fighting some of the so-called rebel groups backed by Turkey, backed by the US, CIA, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. And now we have seen a reconciliation, which is very important. Here, I'm going to cut here. There's a really good reporter, Janan Musa, who's been reporting on the situation in Syria, inside Syria, and partially in Arabic, but also in English. And you can see here on our live stream, Janan Musa, very good reporter. And she posted some of these tweets here, celebrations in the Kurdish majority areas in northeastern Syria. People are celebrating the start of the deployment of the Syrian army to confront Turkish aggression. And then she shows images from Syrian TV entering Tatamur and other areas in Hasaka. And if you look back at the map here, Hasaka's right up here in the northeast. So there's been reports of deployment of the Syrian army in multiple areas, not just in Kobani and Manbij, which are major areas where the YPG SDF fought ISIS, and now the Syrian army is coming back in, but also reports in El Hasaka as well. And Janan Musa also said, I've interviewed a dozen Kurdish officials in northern Syria. I'm not saying that this is an official poll, but it's significant. They all said they prefer the Syrian army to the Turkish army. Nobody I spoke to has plans to leave once the Syrian army arrives. So, there's this really hyperbolic reporting in corporate media. This is the end of the world, but in many ways, this is actually a much more peaceful solution than a permanent presence of U.S. troops occupying Syria's oil-rich region.
Well, I think that's a point to stress, right? So without knowing, the full context and just looking at the Kurdish situation in a vacuum, sure, I mean, what they've done there is amazing, but I guess it's important to at least recognize that it required the presence and the protection of U.S. forces, allowing all these bases in their territory, and the impact of that. For Kurds, it did allow them freedoms that they probably did not enjoy before, and self-determination that they didn't have before. But it still requires a occupying U.S. force inside a country, with the consequence of the rest of the country not being able to benefit from having a cohesive territory. And as you talk about, the bulk of the oil reserves and a huge source of food being in that territory. So it's when we talk about the impact of this, do you think it's important to also stress that there's a whole other part of a country where most Syrians live that is also impacted by this, and they should be in the conversation as well?
Well, of course, absolutely, and it's really important that you're mentioning that. I'm glad. Some people in the comments have been pointing out sanctions. This is something you'll never hear in mainstream corporate media. In fact, right now with Max Blumenthal, who just got back from Syria, the God Voice who was previously on the stream, if you just joined us, we were having technical issues, and we're going to have another stream sometime soon this week when we'll bring Max back on. But the point is that Max just got back from Syria investigating on the ground the effects of sanctions. There are very crippling U.S. and European Union sanctions on Syria that are hurting the entire civilian population. And what's so wild is if you look at corporate media reports, I'm going to get up a report here, there has been a major lack of oil in the country because once again, Syria's oil-rich regions in the northeast have been militarily occupied illegally by the U.S., and also because U.S. and EU sanctions on Iran have prevented Syria from importing oil from a major ally, Iran. So this is what the corporate media says. Syrian fuel shortage squeezes Assad's loyalist. Now, of course, what they don't mention in this is when they say Assad loyalist, this is how sociopathic they are. They're referring to millions of people who live in government-held territory, and they're basically bragging about this. Syria is experiencing a worsening fuel shortage as a result of Western sanctions. Major cities have been brought to a near standstill, coming some of the worst economic circumstances for Assad's loyalists. Now, this is really a kind of sociopathic worldview, because what they're saying is that all of the millions of Syrian civilians who live in Syria under government-held territory, which is at this point the vast majority of the country, that these people are all puppets they're all Assad loyalists. It would be like referring to people living in the U.S. as Trump loyalists.
Yeah.
And then gloating over the fact that they can't get access to oil and gas because of the U.S. military occupation in the Northeast and the sanctions, and also they can't import oil from one of their major neighbors, Iran, that has traditionally been an ally that has sent oil to them. So this is an important development to now reincorporate Northeast Syria into the rest of the Syrian state, so other Syrians can actually have a normal life. This is not about Assad. There's this obsession with making everything about Assad. This is about the fact that now the war is finally going to come closer to an end. And I think that's something that, especially people who claim to be on the left, that's something that we should be encouraging. And we got a great comment here. Thanks so much from Faint Signals from Vega. Thanks for all the wonderful efforts to me, Max, Anya, Aaron, along with the Empire Files, the Grayzone. I will say, the Empire Files, an amazing, amazing show by our friends Abby Martin and Mike Preisner. Check out their new movie, Gaza Fights for Freedom. It's an incredible film.
It's really powerful. It's coming. They're on tour right now, and if they're coming to your town or city, please go. It's also available on demand now, I believe, too, so you can watch it online.
You can stream.
Gaza Fights for Freedom. It's incredible.
There's another great comment here from Lenny Lobstar, who points out Turkey supports ISIS. The Kurds fight ISIS. This is true, and this is something let's talk about really quickly. Now, this is another irony of the war in Syria, and this actually is a good segue. What's so funny seeing in the past few days, 700 viewers, that's great. So awesome to see so many people. Thanks for joining us. And I'm glad we figured out our technical issues. Let us know if there's any other problems. I think we solved our audio issues, and hopefully you can see us well. But getting back to this issue of Turkey and ISIS. Now, what's so funny is that for years, Turkey was supporting ISIS, and there was this obvious relationship there where there was something called the Jihadi Highway. Here, I'll cut back to our special effects here, our map. This northern border here, the border with Turkey, there are areas here, especially around. So you can see this green here are the so-called rebel-held areas, and Turkey is in fact militarily occupying this area as well. Turkey ethnically cleansed this area, Afrin, and this area, Idlib, is under the control basically almost entirely of Al-Qaeda's rebranded affiliate, which is the largest Al-Qaeda affiliate since 9/11. And Turkey has been basically working on and off with the Al-Qaeda rebranded affiliate. Sometimes, they're fighting. Sometimes, in some cases, HTS, which is the name of the rebranded Al-Qaeda affiliate. At some points, there were videos posted on social media of the Turkish army working with HTS, rebranded Al-Qaeda, going through Idlib, or at least this northern area on the border with Turkey. But what's interesting is that this whole area for a while was referred to as the Jihadi Highway, because Turkey was allowing thousands and thousands of extremist Takfiri Salafi jihadists from around the world, from Chechnya, from Xinjiang in China, from Tunisia, from Saudi Arabia, and they were coming to Turkey, and there was a porous border, and they were simply allowed to come in here and, as this person pointed out, fighting Kurdish-led forces and ethnically cleansing and attacking Kurdish civilians in many of these communities, especially Kobani, taking over these areas over here, Al-Bab, Jarablus, Afrin. So this is the irony, is that this NATO ally, right? We always hear Turkey is our NATO ally. For years, the U.S. was fine with this.
Yeah.
And you can actually find online, I would recommend, Joe Biden spilled the beans a few years ago. Joe Biden gave a speech at Harvard University, and in the Q&A session, he was asked about the relationship of U.S. allies and ISIS, and he admitted that Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia were supporting ISIS for years, and the U.S. knew that. We also, we have a very important 2014 email from Hillary Clinton acknowledging that Saudi Arabia and Qatar were supporting ISIS. So this was an open secret.
Let me read the Biden quote, because it's so important. So this is Joe Biden speaking in public at a event at Harvard, right? And he says, "Our biggest problem was our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks, who are great friends and have a great relationship with Erdogan, who I've just spent a lot of time with, the Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world.
So this is Biden speaking at Harvard's Kennedy School. Harvard's Kennedy School is very far from obviously some kind of anti-imperialist beacon. This is actually where Harvard trains people to be diplomats and politicians. And what's funny about that quote, I had that quote up a moment ago. The one thing about the quote is he accidentally said Emiratis. He meant Qataris. Mm-hmm. And he later apologized to the Emiratis. But
the thing is, he apologized to everybody.
Oh yeah.
He went on a tour. This quote was obviously controversial, and it sparked a lot of questions, to say the least. So Biden, to temper down the anger from his allies, the same ones he was calling out, he went on a personal apology tour to basically all these places to apologize and to take back that brief moment of honesty, which is just amazing. What he articulates there, it's what basically people like you, Ben, and Rania Kalik and Max have been saying for years, and you see the pushback you guys get when you point it out. When Joe Biden says it, he can't. Even the vice president can't stand by it. He has to go do an apology to the U.S. allies that the U.S. was working with to fuel this proxy war.
Yeah, and I was going to say, this isn't the only piece of evidence. There's another article I wrote originally at Salon. It's up at Grayzone 2 from 2016. And this was when, so many in the Democratic Party, the DNC establishment, were freaking out over the WikiLeaks leak of Podesta emails. But one of those emails from 2014 is a leaked intelligence assessment. And you can see here, it proves that the U.S. knew Saudi Arabia and Qatar were supporting ISIS. Here is I have the excerpt from the actual email. And keep in mind, this is a 2014 email that is citing U.S. and Western intelligence services, right? Sources. And the WikiLeaks email from Podesta's email box from Hillary Clinton says, "We need to use our diplomatic and more traditional intelligence assets to bring pressure on the governments of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which are providing clandestine financial and logistical support to ISIL and other radical Sunni groups in the region." So the U.S. knew this. They knew Turkey was doing it. And what's so interesting to see now is that some of the same people who not only were supporting these Salafi jihadi so-called rebels, they actually embedded with these rebels. And now that they're so openly attacking Kurdish civilians, trying to ethnically cleanse this area, while embedded within the Turkish army, all they did is change their uniforms and maybe cut their beard. And now so many people, like Danny Gold and many of these other pundits, who once were, again, embedded with these rebels, they're now trying to basically rewrite their record.
They also, the FSA also helped Turkey attack Kurdish civilians in Afrin, but that didn't engender the same kind of outcry as it's doing now. I guess because it was quieter. It was done. It was just done for whatever reason. It didn't get as much attention as this operation is getting now. But we have a couple of questions, Ben, that I want to get to because people are putting them in. So, Osama Qasim says, "You guys have correctly pointed out that the Turkish-backed FSA are jihadists, to the dismay of people like Max Boot." Max Boot is the neocon pundit who writes for the Washington Post, supported the Iraq War, the war in Libya, you name it,
and is now portrayed as the resistance because he's a never Trump Republican.
Are people starting to see their true colors? So are people starting to see the true colors of groups like the FSA? And the second part of this question has to do with Idlib, the last remaining province of Syria under the control of insurgents, controlled basically by an al-Qaeda affiliate. And will Syria be able to retake Idlib?
Those are great questions. The first I'll say is, yeah, I think people are seeing their true colors. And this is the irony. I was just going to point out that you look at some of these journalists, right? Our friend Alex Rubinstein pointed out on Twitter, a great tweet here, that this guy, Danny Gold, who used to work at Vice and at Moderate Rebels, the show I have with Max Blumenthal, we've talked about how Vice kind of merged with the Obama administration, began pushing a lot of pro-war propaganda on Ukraine, Venezuela, and Syria. Danny Gold used to work with Vice, and he was embedded with some of these Takfiri rebels. And he said, he wrote this yesterday, right? So this is on Sunday, October 13th. Opened up Facebook to see a fighter I had embedded with in 2013 is active in one of the Turkish backed groups attacking northeast Syria right now. And he was originally in an so-called FSA group, referring to this Free Syrian Army. And ironically, he was fighting the YPG, the Kurdish-led fighters, in 2013. And then Danny Gold continues, I lost touch with him years ago. It's strange to see the trajectory people have taken. He's lost friends to Nusra, ISIS, and the YPG. Sad to see him not participating. So we have someone who, oh, by the way, and then then Alex Rubinstein takes those tweets and then points, this is what his Danny Gold's report was for Vice. Chatting about Game of Thrones with Syria's most feared Islamic militants. I mean, it says everything. So this is the guy who in 2013 was whitewashing hardline Takfiri Islamist extremists. And then now he's suddenly, oh yeah, it's so strange to see. And you can see, that's Jabhat al-Nusra. Yeah, Jabhat al-Nusra, I'm pretty sure. So, I mean, what's so crazy is seeing these people who were whitewashing the FSA now admitting, because it's so open, even U.S. government officials, and maybe you can talk about Brett McGurk. I mean, the FSA for years, there's actually a professor in Washington, D.C. named Mark Lynch. And I'll get up his quote in a second, but this is a mainstream scholar. He was not in any way, an anti-imperialist, anti-war activist, but even he acknowledged that the FSA never really existed as a unified entity. It was always a brand, this idea of the Free Syrian Army, and the CIA, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, Turkey were supporting these groups, Jordan, that didn't have a unified, coherent structure. They were simply warlords and different groups fighting around. And you were going to read something.
Well, it's just, to your point, and I think it's, because Syria is so complicated and not all of us follow it as closely as you do. So the overall point here is that basically now that the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, is attacking Kurds so brazenly and killing them so openly, now people who previously portrayed them as moderate rebels and as freedom fighters that were worthy of hundreds of millions of dollars from the U.S. and other countries worth of weapons and aid, now that they're killing Kurds, now people are starting to claim that, oh my God, the horror, this is terrible. So they're rightfully calling out their atrocities now. But you're saying that these are the same people who previously were whitewashing the FSA as they were carrying out atrocities and killing people and disregarding civilian lives in places like Aleppo, right? I mean,
and I got this photo here. I mean, we've been warning about this for years. This photo is from several years ago. And this idea that the so-called Free Syrian Army, you can see in the middle here, this flag with the 3 red stars. It's also a French-era colonial flag, by the way. But aside from that, it was reappropriated by the CIA-backed so-called opposition. And these rebel groups, the idea that they were somehow independent from the other Salafi jihadists is ridiculous. This is a photo they themselves took. Next to it, the white flag, you can see in Arabic it says Ahra Sham. That was a major kind of Muslim Brotherhood-oriented Takfiri group that was backed largely by Turkey and Qatar. And then on the right, you can see this black Salafi flag, which is Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate. So this idea that they were always independent is simply not true. There were many instances. Ironically, there were actually historic instances where some of these groups allied together, including the FSA and not just Al-Qaeda, but also ISIS, to fight the Kurdish-led YPG forces. So this is actually not new. They've been fighting each other for years. What was new is that elements of the YPG leadership, which rebranded as the SDF, decided to ally with the U.S. government, which is leading us to the point we are today. But you should read, Aaron has up a quote here from that Assadist rag, the New York Times.
Well, yeah, so, this, let me just, by way of, as a personal note, this is when, for me, the Syrian war really became clear, because I didn't really follow it very closely. I just kind of relied on people who I trust to explain it. And I just, when I saw Max and Ben and Rania getting attacked so much, for what they were saying, I didn't fully get why. And when they first were talking about, all these basically fake rebels, I was like, whoa, that's like, wow, I thought they were rising up for their freedom. But then I read this article in the New York Times by Robert F. Worth, who is a veteran Middle East correspondent. And
very centrist, very mainstream.
And he talked about what he witnessed in places around the country. And I want to read, and he painted the rebels, who we were told were all freedom fighters, just fighting for freedom against a genocidal dictator. He pointed out that they were also basically that they were committing massive human rights abuses and had a huge sectarian element, where basically people of other sects, people who are not Wahhabi, were basically being targeted. So he talked about Aleppo, and Aleppo, which is, the way Aleppo was portrayed to us in Western media was that it was this besieged town fighting off the evil Syrian government and Russian invaders. But actually, Aleppo...
well, and not just that, by the way. Numerous media outlets referred to it as a Holocaust. Here's Josh Rogan, a major pundit, and this is reprinted here, but Josh Rogan referred to the Aleppo liberation as a Holocaust. So, I mean, the hyperbolic media propaganda is so crazy.
So I'll read you what Robert F. Worth wrote, and he talks about speaking to...
Well, hold on a second. Here we go. This is from that other notorious Assadist rag, the Times of Israel. By the way, Israel was very much involved in the war in Syria. Aleppo mayor describes Holocaust in plea for world help. I mean, like, this is just like the most extreme propaganda you can get, referring to what was a liberation from hardline Takfiri Salafi jihadi groups as a Holocaust.
Okay, so Robert F. Worth writes, he says...
And keep in mind, this is in the New York Times, and I'm getting up the quote here as well.
Okay, yeah. So Robert, so he talks about speaking to a lawyer who supported the initial protests against Assad in 2011, because again, there were these protests calling for reforms. It is a police state. It's an authoritarian government. There was genuine grievance against Assad, and people were rising up in some areas to call for reforms. The problem is that gets conflated with a militarized and sectarian element, and all of a sudden in Western media we're supposed to believe that the people who are taking over Aleppo are the same people who are rising up and protesting for basic reforms in 2011, which is just not the case, as evidenced by this quote from Robert F. Worth. So he says, "In March, I met a lawyer named Anas Jude who took part in some of the 2011 protests. Jude no longer considers himself a member of the opposition. I asked him why. He said, no one is 100% with the regime, but mostly these people are unified by their resistance to the opposition. They know what they don't want, not what they want. In December, he said, Syrians abroad who believe in the revolution would call me and say, we lost Aleppo. And I would say, what do you mean? It was only a Turkish card guarded by jihadis. For these exiled Syrians, he said, the specter of Assad's crimes looms so large they cannot see anything else. They refuse to acknowledge the realities of a rebellion that is corrupt, brutal, and compromised by foreign sponsors. This is true. Eastern Aleppo may not have been Raqqa, where ISIS advertised its rigid Islamist dystopia and its mass beheadings, but as a symbol of Syria's future, it was almost as bad. A chaotic wasteland full of feuding militias, some of them radical Islamists, who hoarded food and weapons while the people starved," unquote.
And again, where is this? This is the New York Times, right here. This is the New York Times Magazine, Aleppo After the Fall,
and so
by Robert F. Worth.
So after reading that, that's when I just really got that these are the people those who are cheerleading for regime change in the West and who are cheerleading for a proxy war that is flooding this poor country with weapons and even foreign fighters who aren't even from Syria. These are the people who we are supposed to be cheerleading for, and we're being asked to cheerlead for a country's destruction.
There's another article. First they stole everything, then they burned everything. These are the so-called rebels we're supposed to support. And then look, this is what happened to the country. And this is the ultimate tragedy. This country did survive the war, but at what cost, right? I mean, it wasn't balkanized in the way that many Western countries wanted, but it was really destroyed in a large part.
All right. Well,
and then, so to get back to Osama's question here, great question, Osama Qasim. The other question about Idlib. Idlib is hard. It's up in the air. I mean, we can't predict the future, but what we can say is that there have been talks going on. You might not really hear much about in Western corporate media, which acts as though they don't exist, but there have been negotiations going on between Russia, Iran, and Turkey in Astana. And those independent talks, which again don't involve the U.S. and the other Western countries that tried to overthrow Syria, those are important talks to come to some kind of agreement on Idlib. Now, the thing, though, is for people who don't follow this war too closely, Idlib is this area here that is controlled pretty much entirely by Al-Qaeda over here. And what's funny is on this map, there's like a white part because they try to separate them from the other elements of the opposition as if they're somehow different. But Idlib is, it's Al-Qaeda heartland. In fact, that's not my quote. Who referred to Idlib as Al-Qaeda's heartland? It was, in fact, Charles Lister. Charles Lister is one of the major lobbyists for the opposition in Washington who works for Gulf-funded think tanks. He used to work for the Brookings Institution and is a notorious, war propagandist. So the situation is really difficult, and we'll see what happens at Idlib. But now that the Northeast is finally going to come to some kind of peace, I think hopefully Idlib is going to be the last piece of puzzle, and then finally this war will end. There's so many people living comfortably in the West and major cities in the U.S. and Europe and Germany and France, cheering on the destruction of this country in the Middle East, cheering on these sanctions that have made lives hell for thousands and thousands of civilians.
All right, let's read a couple of super chats.
Oh, well, thank you to Mission at MI55. Ian.
Thank you, MI55. Great name.
Thank you, MI5.
Yeah.
You might want to hide a little more clearly, but at least thanks for the money. Everyone knew we were secret MI5 assets.
Osama Qasim says that Foreign Policy did a piece recently that HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, was a better alternative to the Syrian government. Well, that's been basically been the prevailing narrative. Some people have the honesty to admit that that's what they believe, like Charles Lister, basically, right? The neocon regime change lobbyist in Washington. But basically, that's what gets sort of mixed up here, is that in the course of cheering for this sort of amorphous and vaguely defined rebels, no one actually ever says who they want to have replace the Assad government.
This is Charles Lister I put up.
And that's why it's, and look, if you care about human rights, I mean, no one's gonna, I mean, at least, like, from my vantage point, there's nothing about Assad that I find appealing. He is a authoritarian leader. He presides over a police state. He has a corrupt circle of cronies around him. There's nothing to cheer there. But then the problem is, in this bid to cheer on this proxy war to oust him, no one ever says who they would rather have replace him and who would replace him. And then you read between the lines, and you can read also in places like Foreign Affairs, and you hear from actual experts who say quietly that, as John Kerry told those members of the Syrian opposition, that basically that the U.S. was watching ISIS advance on Damascus, and they were hoping that would create some leverage for them to negotiate, I guess, Assad's exit. But basically, so even the U.S. was watching as ISIS was advancing on Damascus and threatening to take over, and if not ISIS, then it would have been, I guess, Al-Qaeda. So that's like the better alternative to ISIS. So that is who would have basically won here. And it's amazing how that just gets swept under the rug, and we're supposed to live in this fantasy world where, as long as we oppose this authoritarian leader, then everything's fine, with no regard to the actual consequences of seeing that proxy war come to its logical conclusion.
Yeah, and there's a really important document that was actually released from 2012. I'm getting it up now, from the Defense Intelligence Agency. This is from the U.S. government. And this is thanks to Brad Hoff, who's a good reporter. And he found this document that was declassified. And this, again, is from the U.S. government itself. This is from 2012, early in the war, right at the beginning of the war. So the U.S. government knew what was happening. And this incredible, incredible document, which is never acknowledged in mainstream corporate media, it says, again, keep in mind, this is the U.S. government admitting back in 2012, the West, Gulf countries, and Turkey support the Syrian opposition. And, quote, this is an exact quote, there is a possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria, Hasaka and Deir ez-Zor, and that is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want in order to isolate the Syrian regime. Now, as we mentioned, Deir ez-Zor and Hasaka, the areas we're talking about, who controlled that territory over here in the east? It was ISIS. It was ISIS. So this document is acknowledging the U.S. government knew in 2012 that there would be what they called a Salafist principality. So this kind of extremist Salafi jihadist Islamic State, which is what emerged. They knew that back in 2012. And you can look through the other parts of this document here. This is, again, a U.S. government defense intelligence agency document in 2012. 2012! 7 years ago. People are pretending like this is a surprise. All right, this is what it says. Internally, events are taking a clear sectarian direction. Again, so the U.S. government was admitting in 2012 that it was already going in a sectarian direction. And then they said the Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and AQI, that means Al-Qaeda in Iraq, are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, of course, became ISIS. And then they also mention, again, the U.S. government admits internally, this was a declassified document, this was an internal report. Al-Qaeda in Iraq supported the Syrian opposition from the beginning, both ideologically and through the media. And then they say, after the rise of insurgency in Syria, religious and tribal powers in the region began to sympathize with the sectarian uprising. The sympathy appeared in Friday's prayer sermons, which called on volunteers to support the Sunnis in Syria and portraying it as a kind of sectarian uprising. So again, where did this come from? This is a 2012 Defense Intelligence Agency U.S. government report. And now here we are 7 years later, and finally you have some of these propagandists in the corporate media who are acknowledging that the rebels they propagandize on behalf of are not freedom-loving Democrats. Here's another, we were talking about this guy, Danny Gold. This is the Vice reporter who chatted about Game of Thrones with Takfiri jihadis in Syria. Here's another one. This is a former Israeli soldier who's now one of these think tank so-called experts. And our friend Dan Cohen says she admits her pen pals are mutilating Syrian children and then justifies their crimes because they're traumatized. Here are her quotes. This is from 2 days ago, October 12th. The worst thing for me about doing research on the invasion of northeast Syria is not watching field executions or looking at photos of mutilated children. Wait, let's stop there. The worst thing is not seeing mutilated children. How is that not the worst thing?
That's
what?
Crazy.
That is...
So,
what?
And who is she?
Elizabeth Tuskov is a former Israeli soldier who has now become a major think tanker. She works for Western think tanks and is a PhD candidate in the United States. And
Okay.
she is always writing articles for Western media outlets, writing about the Syrian rebels. She has a lot of contacts with the Syrian opposition. She's a major opposition supporting journalist. And she says, the worst thing is not seeing photos of mutilated children. It is talking to the Syrians fighting on Turkey's behalf, trying to justify what they're doing. And then she's saying, these are deeply traumatized men, placed in a position no human should ever find themselves in. Displaced from your home, locked inside Syria, no job opportunities. Many in their position... Whoa! Many in their position would mutilate children? What? We're supposed to believe that the worst thing is not that these Takfiri extremists who are backed by the CIA and are now backed by Turkey, the worst thing is not the fact that they're mutilating children, but that they're in that situation.
So and that really captures the mentality. And you know what it actually reminds me of? It reminds me sort of the American Zionist mentality, that it's more important for an American Jew to feel good that there is a Jewish home, irrespective of all the horrible consequences, including death, torture, destruction of Palestinians. So it's and this is it's the same thing. It's more important for a Western pundit to feel, I guess, they feel some kind of validation that they're involved in supporting and justifying a Western regime change project that they've convinced themselves is a freedom struggle, I guess, than it is to consider the impact of the fact that the people that they're cheering on and they're talking to, they're having correspondence with, are mutilating children. And it's like the whole thing. It presumes that the people's lives don't matter. If we're interested, if we're doing research in a country, then it's like everyone's a toy. Everyone's a game.
And it's so distant. It's as if people on the ground don't matter, and it's all just a conceptual exercise.
It's so
this
sick.
is the person I was just quoting. She is a fellow in the Middle East program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a doctoral student in political science at Princeton University. These are the so-called experts who are helping lead policy on Syria. And just look at this. I mean, the crisis in Idlib. This is the person who's advising. You can also look. So, also she's writing for foreign policy now regularly. So this person who's previously a development and research manager at the Education for Peace in Iraq Center. Again, this is a former Israeli soldier, and now this person is helping to lead policy on Syria, just like the same journalist for Vice who embedded with Takfiri jihadis and talked about Game of Thrones are now admitting, oh, it's so sad to see how these people who used to be fighting in the CIA-backed militia in 2013, it's so sad now they're fighting an alliance with Turkey. It's like, well, maybe if someone is a mercenary who's willing to fight for one foreign power, they'll go to the next foreign power. And the idea that it's some principled revolution, maybe that was a Western media caricature.
Yeah, it's really cynical, and it's like there was a time when I could understand because again, it's a police state. You sympathize with anybody who's fighting for their rights, but the people who used that and conflated it with a foreign-backed, including U.S.-backed proxy war that tore apart a country and that flooded it with weapons and supported people who have no concern for democracy and freedom, but actually have a sectarian motivation. It's so cynical and it's cowardly and it's amazing. It just as an observer, because I'm not very closely involved in this issue. It's been amazing to watch the malice that people like you and Max and Rania and others Dan Cohen get for trying to point this out, and then the incentives that it creates for people just to either go along with the regime change cheerleading or to be silent about it. So many leftists have just decided it's toxic. There's no point in talking about it because you're going to get smeared as an Assadist. You won't get bylines. It's been really brutal. And I don't want to make this about journalists because obviously Western journalists are not the victims on either side of the war.
The victims are the millions of Syrians whose lives have been destroyed.
Yeah.
So Western powers could just destabilize this country and just control the region and control its natural resources, overthrow one of the only governments that refuses to recognize Israel, that is not allied with Saudi Arabia. I mean, that is secular. Regardless of what you think about the Syrian government, it is one of the only secular governments in the region. And let's talk about this really quickly. Again, the victims are not Western journalists, but people should understand how this lobby works, how the pro-war lobby works. So our colleague Max Blumenthal was just attacked a few days ago in Foreign Policy magazine. This is an establishment pro-war journal, and also our friend Rania Kalik, who works with us at the Grayzone sometimes. Rania is pointing out, so this person in Foreign Policy, a political scientist, wrote this article smearing them, libeling them as supposed Russian shills who take money from, quote, Assad regime lobby groups, which is ridiculous. And Rania demanded a retraction from Foreign Policy. Max said, this is a heinous lie, did not take a dime. And he pointed out the irony. The same people accusing Max and Rania and the rest of us of being shills of Russia. Meanwhile, they're writing in Foreign Policy, which is directly brought to you by the United Arab Emirates. Look right here. It says, Foreign Policy greatly acknowledges support from the Embassy of the UAE, which made these initiatives possible. If I need to remind viewers here, the UAE is an extreme, absolute monarchy. They don't even pretend to have elections. They have literal modern-day slavery going on in the United Arab Emirates. They're supporting Al-Qaeda in Yemen. So meanwhile, the people smearing us as supposedly Russian shills working for the Assad regime lobby, they're actually working with UAE-sponsored publications. He also points out Foreign Policy's longtime editor signed on last year to lobby for the UAE for $50,000 a month. And then continuing, finally, keeps going. Here we go. This guy who attacked Max and Rania, he equates a token award from a Bay Area. That's what they're talking about, the Assad lobby. But no, here's the most important thing. This neocon attacking Max for his factual reporting has also done work for the Integrity Initiative. Now, you might have never heard of the Integrity Initiative because it was blacklisted in Western corporate media. There was very little reporting on it. This is a propaganda group that was funded by the British Foreign Office and NATO, and it was run by British military intelligence officers, and we actually have a report on it here at the Grayzone. Inside the Temple of Covert Propaganda, the Integrity Initiative, looking, and you can look at the report by Max and our friend Mohammed Amazi, looking at how this British government-funded group was not only doing propaganda, but also attacking the left, attacking the anti-war left. Here, the Integrity Initiative published this thing called Russia and the European Far Left, trying to portray the left as all just Russian boogeymen, right? And then I pointed out, I found some of these tweets where this British government-funded group, this so-called monitoring group, Integrity Initiative, was tweeting out attacks on Jeremy Corbyn, the elected leader of the Labour Party, also attacking George Galloway. So we have a British government-funded group attacking elected politicians. This is an attack on democracy by the British government itself, because these are leftists who dare to challenge bipartisan foreign policy. And then you have other people who do work with this group, smearing our colleague Max Blumenthal as a Assad regime lobbyist. This is absurd, libelous propaganda.
All right, so let's get into some super chats, some questions we've gotten, and then I think we should wrap up pretty soon.
Well, we have to talk about Ukraine Gate.
We're going to save Ukraine Gate for another day. I apologize for the false advertising, but we're going to save Ukraine Gate for another day, because especially once we can come back with and resolve some of the technical issues that we had today, including with Max's feed. So we have Chuck Zlatkin says, great to see Pushback live. Thank you, Chuck. That's really nice of you. Danny O'Brien, thanks for all the great work and truth. Thank you, Danny. Ikram Ibrahim, I truly appreciate all the work you guys do. You guys help keep me informed on these issues. Thank you, Ikram. Thank you. That's really nice. My brother Daniel says,
conflict of interest.
Well, he has a question that we can answer, and I think many people in the chat will hear the answer to this. Ben, can you explain what Israel's interest is in this whole Syria thing? I imagine undermining Hezbollah has something to do with it, but I don't understand Syrian politics enough to be clear on it. I'll just say, and then you can take it away, Ben, is that I do know that Israel, as some Israeli officials or Israeli think tank experts have said, that they love watching just basically Syrians kill each other, and no matter which side it is, that they're happy to sit back and see this, and to see all the ensuing splits that this has caused inside Arab countries, and between Hamas and Syria. Syria was once a huge base for Hamas's support, but the Syrian proxy war caused a fissure there, if I have that right. And then also, I think the main Israeli interest is, as Daniel talks about, is because Iran is there and because Hezbollah is there, they use it as an opportunity to launch these hundreds of strikes inside of Syria, hundreds, which are just taken,
thousands on, actually.
which are just presumed that Israel has the right to do that. Imagine if Syria or Iran launched such strikes against Israel. And so they love any chance they can to go after Hezbollah and Iran, because basically, as Chomsky will say, that Israel does not want any deterrent to its use of aggression in the region. And Iran and Hezbollah are the biggest deterrents to that. So them being in Syria is a chance to weaken them. And this actually sets up a question for you here, Ben, which let me ask you a question, which is that, when I think about what was the interest in all these different factors in fueling this proxy war, I think about the parallels to Afghanistan, where basically the U.S. Entrapped the then Soviet Union into entering in a bid to weaken them. That was the explicit goal of the U.S. And I'm wondering, do you think that a U.S. motive here and a Saudi motive in launching this proxy war was in fact also similar to Afghanistan, by using jihadist proxies, like in Afghanistan, to use jihadist proxies here who do pose a threat to Iran, to use them to actually draw in Iran? That might have been not just an outcome of the Syrian proxy war, but a goal in a bid to bleed Iran in a place where they pretty much, you could argue, had no choice but to fight to defend themselves, because if they hadn't, then ISIS posed a very big threat to them.
Absolutely. So a few things here. I got up some articles. This is really important. So Israel's role in Syria has been crucial, and it's been downplayed. Here are some articles, once again, in notorious Assadist rags like the Times of Israel, acknowledging IDF chief finally acknowledges that Israel supplied weapons to Syrian rebels. So Here we have outgoing IDF Chief of Staff Eisenkot acknowledged for the first time that Israel provided weaponry to Syrian rebel groups in the occupied Golan Heights. This is illegally occupied Syrian territory under international law. He said it was for self-defense. Now, this is just beginning to scratch the surface. Now, here's... No, thank you. I don't want to pay you, give me money. Here... Oh, look who's back. Our friend Elizabeth Terskov. This is the one who said the worst thing in going on in Syria is not seeing photos of mutilated children. It's the men... The fact that it's so sad that they're now mutilating children. So she's back, this so-called expert, inside Israel's secret program to back Syrian rebels. Fighters were armed and paid to keep Iranian-linked forces away from Israel's border. But wait, there's more. Here is the Wall Street Journal, 2017. Israel gives secret aid to Syrian rebels. So there are so many reports acknowledging this is so obvious, it's so confirmed. We've known it for years that Israel was supporting Syrian rebels, including extremist Salafi jihadis. But it gets even worse. Just wait. Israel wasn't just supporting these so-called moderate rebels. Here is another Assadist rag, the Jerusalem Post, a right-wing Israeli newspaper. And meanwhile, here we go. Report, Israel treating Al-Qaeda fighters wounded in Syria civil war. When is this from? 2015. 4 years ago. We've known for over 4 years that Israel was helping support Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia. They don't even pretend to be moderate rebels. Nusra Front is the Sunni Muslim Al-Qaeda offshoot, which is currently fighting the Iranian-backed Axis, the Axis, of Bashar al-Assad and Hezbollah in Syria. So we've known for years now that Israel was supporting these extremist groups. And in fact, I want to show you one of the funniest things of all in the Syria war. This is incredible. Here we go. What happened is, so another thing that people have pointed out is that Israel, not only have they been supporting these rebels, but ironically, ISIS never attacked Israel. Isn't that interesting? Here's a report in The Independent, a major British newspaper. ISIS fighters attacked the IDF, the Israeli military, then apologized, claims former commander Moshe Yalon. So this is directly from not the mouth of the Syrian regime, not the mouth of Hezbollah. This is from a former leader of the IDF. He was referring to an incident.
Ben, we have some requests for you not to clap.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I
get emotional.
Yes.
But I'm going to stop clapping. But anyway,
Yes.
Here we go. ISIS fighters attacked Israel and then apologized. So Israel's role, we have just begun in the past few years to see what Israel's role has been, but there's no question that Israel's involved. Now, why? I mean, I was just showing the evidence. And what I like about doing these live streams is we can show you all these things and we can post links to a lot of these articles and stuff. But look, why was Israel doing it? A few different reasons. Syria is one of the only countries in the region that continues to support Palestinian resistance forces. It's one of the only countries in the region that refuses to recognize Israel. Egypt long ago gave up on the Arab nationalist vision and normalized relations with Israel. Jordan is a U.S. puppet monarchy that obediently works with Israel. Iran and Syria are some of the only countries in the region, and Hezbollah to an extent that there is Lebanon to the extent that there is a state. I mean, Hezbollah is of course one of the major forces fighting against Israel. So Syria, which is allied with these forces, of course Israel wants to destabilize Syria, but also, as these people pointed out in these reports, Iranian-backed forces, not just Hezbollah, but also Iranian allied forces in Syria have been repeatedly attacked by Israel. Something else I didn't even mention is that Israel has admitted to carrying out thousands of airstrikes inside Syria. Now, what's crazy about this is, oh my God, here we go. So if you look this up, one of the first things that comes up in Google is the New York Times. Israel is blamed for deadly missile strikes in Syria. Israel is blamed? By that, the New York Times, of course, means that Israel attacked Syria, but you have to say Israel is blamed because you can't acknowledge the truth. But Israel has actually acknowledged that it has carried out thousands of attacks inside Syrian territory, going pretty far east, in fact, close to the Iraqi border. Here we go. Here's PBS. Israel publicly acknowledges its airstrikes in Syria. So think about this for a second. I'm gonna stop clapping. Sorry. Imagine if Iran carried out airstrikes inside Israel. Think about how much the world would freak out. Israel would use it as an excuse to nuke Iran, or at the very least to destroy Iranian infrastructure, to carry out a barrage of bombings. But Israel feels it has the right to attack Syria not once, not twice, but thousands of times over the past 8 years. And then if Syria ever responds, and at one point Syria did shoot down an Israeli plane, then it's portrayed as Syrian aggression. Much in the same way where if Palestinians respond to being held in an unlivable open-air prison in Gaza, where the UN says that it will be uninhabitable by 2020, which, by the way, oh yeah, that's next year. The UN has said that it's uninhabitable because 97% of the fresh water in Gaza is undrinkable. Meanwhile, if Gazans ever respond to Israeli aggression, it's portrayed as, oh, they're the aggressors. Just as Israel can bomb thousands of times in Syria, and it's not only that, but it's not even seen as a war. Think how crazy that is, that you can bomb a country thousands of times and then people will say, oh, they're not at war.
Yeah.
This is the Orwellian world we live in, where the U.S. is waging 7 wars internationally without approval from Congress. The U.S. has 800 foreign military bases, has presence throughout the world, and its allies, like Israel, that it protects at the UN Security Council with a veto, it lets its allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel, just destroy the region, just kill millions of people, just destroy all of Yemen, just turn this country into rubble and starve millions of people to death. And the U.S. is preventing anything from happening.
So I think we should wrap it up, Ben. So let me ask you, just as we conclude, what do you think happens next? So you have Syria and the Assad government looking like they're making some sort of deal already, an agreement for basically Assad to take military control of the area surrounding the Kurdish zone. So what do you think happens next? And do you think, you've already talked about Idlib and whether or not what the outcome will be there, which, as you said, seems very uncertain. But at least when it comes to this Kurdish front, what do you think happens there next?
Well, we had a good question here from Obaid Haki, who said, sending a few bucks so Ben can get an earpiece that stays in place. Thank you so much. I will use it to buy a better earpiece. This is an awful earpiece. Do the Kurds have a long-term home anywhere, he asked. They're mostly Sunni, so I'm guessing not Iran or Iraq. Well, look, this is a complex issue that people in the region need to decide among themselves. And, I'm a white Westerner. I'm not going to decide the answers for them. But what I can say is that we shouldn't be supporting ethno-sectarian separatism and balkanization. The idea that there needs to be an independent state that is based purely on ethnic lines, that's called Israel. And what's really wild, actually, is that recently a U.S. National Security Council official said openly that the U.S. wanted to create a Kurdistan to balkanize and divide up the region. Let me get this quote up here, because this is important to understand that the U.S. is not doing this because it actually cares about Kurds. Here's the quote. This is from one of my tweets. This was said to Newsweek. If Trump's withdrawal of U.S. forces had not occurred, the National Security Council official told Newsweek, the United States could have continued to refine the buffer zone on the Syrian-Turkish border. To be honest with you, it would be better for the United States to support a Kurdish nation across Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, said the National Security Council official. It would be another Israel in the region. Come on, do we really need another Israel in the region? But even aside from that kind of rhetoric, look, Kurds are part of Iraq, Turkey, Iran, and Syria. Now, Turkey viciously oppresses the Kurdish population. And they have been oppressed for decades and upon decades. And there's no question whatsoever that Turkey has carried out horrible crimes against humanity against its Kurdish population. But just because Turkey has repressed the Kurdish population doesn't mean that every country in the region is the same. Now, it's true that Iraq also viciously repressed the Kurdish population. Ironically, after the U.S. once again did something very similar over the years, over a period of decades, the U.S. encouraged Kurdish-led groups in Iraq to rise up against Saddam, most famously during the Gulf War. Most famously, Henry Kissinger did the same. And, of course, the Kurds in Iraq were massacred by Saddam. This is, of course, after the U.S. supported the coup in Iraq that overthrew a leftist Soviet-allied government in Iraq, and then installed a government that was led by Saddam Hussein. And then the CIA helped work with Saddam and gave him a list of all the members of the Iraqi Communist Party to kill and purge and exile all of the Iraqi communists. So the U.S. played this game supporting Saddam. During the Iran-Iraq War, the U.S. and European allies gave chemical weapons to Saddam as he was gassing Iranians and Kurds. And then, of course, the U.S. played both sides, supporting the Kurds against Saddam. So there's this policy going back decades. So there's no question whatsoever that Kurds are absolutely repressed and have a history of oppression in Turkey and Iraq. Syria is not the same, though. And people need to stop pretending like Syria and Turkey are the same thing. And I'll recommend for anyone watching this, you don't need to listen to me talk about this as... Sorry, I hit my mic. You don't need to listen to me talking about this as a white Westerner. I did a really interesting interview when Aaron and I used to work at The Real News before going independent. And here this is at The Real News, the complex history and relations of the Kurdish, YPG, Syria, and U.S. And I talked to a really good journalist who's a Kurdish journalist inside Turkey, Ali Ornek, who is not at all in any way a sympathizer with Erdogan and the regime in Turkey. But he talks about how many of the myths of Syria treating Kurds like Turkey are not true. And here's an example he points out. Actually, after the war in Syria, the Kurdish question in Syria was, we're listening to a corrupt version of the history of Kurds. Actually, 2.5 million Kurds are living in Syria, and only 130,000 of those were without a Syrian passport. This is one of the examples people say of the repression, the purported repression of Kurds in Syria. This goes back to the 1920s, when there were tribal uprisings led by Kurds against the Turkish state, and they cracked down, and some of the Kurds fled to Syria. And ironically, what he points out is that the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, was supporting this idea going back in the 1980s. They had this journal, and they mostly relate to the problems of Kurds in Syria. And they said that it's a refugee problem. So he talks about how, in fact, the PKK published a eulogy for Hafez al-Assad when he died. And when there was an uprising in the 1980s, the so-called Hama uprising or Hama massacre, the PKK itself in its journal referred to it as a U.S. conspiracy using the Ikhwan and Muslim Brotherhood, which actually is pretty much true at this point. We know we have declassified documents. And he also points out that, anyway, the point is that, look, the PYD, which is the political arm, and you can find more of this information if you go back to this interview. The point is that, ironically, Öcalan, the leader of the YPG PKK, where was he living before being captured? Öcalan was actually living in Damascus. This is the complicated history. The YPG and Syrian government, / the YPG/PKK and Syrian government are not enemies. It was only recently in the past few years when the SDF, which rebranded, the Syrian Democratic Forces, they were the rebranded Kurdish-led group. They were working with the U.S. Before that, they actually didn't have an antagonistic relationship with the Syrian government. In fact, once again, Öcalan, the ideological leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, who's now in a maximum security Turkish prison after being captured with the help of the U.S., by the way. So it shows what happens when you ally with the U.S. They still betray you. But Öcalan was living in Damascus for years inside Syria. And there was a period in the 80s and 90s of what was called the invisible war or the undeclared war between Turkey and Syria, where Syria was supporting the Kurdish insurgency against the Turkish state, and there was a kind of proxy war. And of course, Syria supported the Kurdish insurgency against Turkey as a form of revenge because Turkey supported the Hama uprising of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1980s to overthrow the Syrian state. Anyway, the point is, this is a long and complex history, but the Kurds in Syria have not had the same antagonistic relationship with the state that they've had in Turkey. So the answer to this question is, should we support this Balkanization strategy, which, as I showed, the U.S. government wants to break up? The U.S. government wants to break up this region and create what it refers to as another Israel. Here, I'll show another example of this. It's not just the U.S. that is trying to Balkanize the Middle East. There was an even more interesting example where Benjamin Netanyahu himself, who, by the way, is actually guilty of ethnic cleansing. Look at this tweet. This is incredible. This is from the far-right Prime Minister of Israel, a war criminal. Israel strongly condemns the Turkish invasion of the Kurdish areas. Everyone should do that. This is an illegal invasion by Turkey. And then Benjamin Netanyahu said, and warns against the ethnic cleansing of the Kurds by Turkey and its proxies. Israel is prepared to extend humanitarian assistance to the gallant Kurdish people. Okay, are they going to extend humanitarian assistance to the Gazans they have in an open-air concentration camp? And by the way, it's not just me saying that. The notorious anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist communist known as the former conservative prime minister of Britain, David Cameron, he himself admitted that Gaza is an open-air prison. Those are his words. So meanwhile, here we are. Benjamin Netanyahu is offering humanitarian intervention. You should be very skeptical, as I said. Turkey's invasion is illegal. So too was the U.S. occupation. The only solution is an alliance with the Syrian government and returning to a multi-ethnic state. And of course, this is that quote I mentioned where the U.S. wants to try to create another Israel in the region and carve up the region. So look, the only solution is returning back to a multi-ethnic, multifaceted state, which is what Syria is. Regardless of what you think about the leadership of the state, it is one of the only countries in the region where the equality is guaranteed for, it's a secular state, Christians, Druze, Muslims, both Sunnis and Shia, and other people from other religious minorities, the Yazidis, have guaranteed equal rights under law. And yes, the state is very repressive, but the state is very, very committed to defending the multifaceted tapestry of different ethnicities and religions. So that is the solution, not further balkanization of the region and ethnic sectarian lines, because that is exactly what the British and French colonial powers wanted 100 years ago in 1916, when at the end of World War I, they carved up the empire of the Ottomans with the Sykes-Picot Agreement on ethno-sectarian lines to help divide the region and played people against each other, including the French supported the Alawites against others. And there's this history of using different ethnic groups against each other as a form of ethnocentric separatism and sectarianism. They want to continue doing that to this day to better balkanize the region.
And we're going to wrap there. And I'm going to just conclude, Ben, by reading this. If you can put it up on the screen, there's a tweet from Donald J. Trump. He says, after defeating 100% of the ISIS caliphate, well, not true. It was the Kurds who did that, and also it was Russia, Iran, Hezbollah.
Well, quick point on this,
it's here who did that. No. We're going to wrap. I largely moved our troops out of Syria. So anyway, let's put that aside. Let Syria and Assad protect the Kurds and fight Turkey for their own land. I said to my generals, why should we be fighting for Syria and Assad to protect the land of our enemy? Anyone who wants to assist Syria in protecting the Kurds is good with me. Whether it is Russia, China, or Napoleon, I hope they all do great. We are 7,000 miles away.
Also, this is 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, so this is very recent, and it's strange. I mean, as incoherent and as awful as Trump is, it's strange that the Democratic Party and parts of the left are letting him seize the anti-war mantle, even though it's obviously very disingenuous, because as he is now pulling troops back from Syria. He's putting more troops in Saudi Arabia. He's still supporting the mass murder of Saudi Arabia in Yemen. He's supporting Israel's occupation of Palestine. And he's increased U.S. bombings around the world. So, but it's strange, though, that rhetorically the Democratic Party and parts of the left are ceding sort of the anti-war rhetorical mantle to him. It's a reflection of the bizarre time we're in. Ben Norton, you have 1 minute. You only have 1 minute to wrap up because we're way over time and we have to go. And let me just say before we go that, again, we're sorry for the technical issues we had before. We're going to resolve them next time and get Max Blumenthal in, and that's when we'll do the other issues we talked about doing, which was Ecuador and also Ukraine Gate, because there's a lot to say on those fronts as well. And certainly there'll be a lot more developing on the Syria front as well. So hope you'll come back and join us next time on our Grayzone Pushback live chat after we sort out the technical kinks. Final word, Ben Norton, 1 minute, and then we're out.
Yeah, make a few quick notes here. So let's go back to Trump's tweet. One important thing, I will say, I echo what Aaron said. This should be the position, for the most part, of people who claim to be anti-war and claim to be on the left. And it's really shocking and really revolting to see people on the left arguing in support of continued U.S. military occupation of the Middle East. U.S. out of the Middle East. That should be the left anti-war position. But there's a quick caveat he mentions here. I largely moved our troops out of Syria. Now, that qualification is important because there are reports that we'll talk about this in the future, that the U.S. is still leaving troops in this area right here, the Atamf border crossing. Now, why would they do that, of course? This is where Syria meets its border with Iraq and also Jordan. This is an area that was controlled by CIA-backed rebels. And this is also an area where the U.S. is going to have a continued military presence to prevent Iranian-backed Iraqi forces and really prevent Iranian influence inside Syria. So still, the regime change war continues in different ways. The U.S. military presence is not completely gone, although it is good that the U.S. is probably going to finally withdraw from occupying the oil-rich breadbasket region in the northeast. And then we can also say that the sanctions are continuing, and that is itself a continuation of the regime change war. So unfortunately, the war is not completely over. But so I'm done talking there, but before we leave, we should maybe answer a few of your questions, because we talked a lot about Syria there, and maybe we still
No. We gotta go.
Okay.
So we're gonna pick up questions next time. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We really appreciate your support. Stay tuned to the Gray Zone for more, and let's say goodbye.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thanks a lot. Keep watching us soon. We will be back soon. We will be talking about Ukraine Gate with Aaron and our colleague Max Blumenthal. So definitely keep an eye on that. And of course, you can go to thegrayzone.com for more of our reporting. As always, thank you so much for listening. We're sorry for the technical issues in this first live stream we've ever done, but I think in the future we'll have those ironed out, and hopefully it'll be cool.
We will for sure.
Great. All right, we'll talk to you all soon. See ya.
Thank you.